go. All right. I think we are recording now. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining me. I know April is busy for you, and April also has lots of religious holidays in it, right? Sorry about, sort of rescheduling this meeting. I figured out we would have a greater chance of people joining us if it was the Easter weekend. So we'll talk a little bit, and thanks by the way for all of your ideas, especially Ahmed. Sort of you've suggested the topic of de-dollarization, right? And so we can talk a little bit more about this today. And as always, at any time, feel free just to interrupt me and to speak up, and sort of we'll go from there. But Hadi is not joining us today. So Hadi is traveling to visit with his relatives, and so he should be back in the country at the end of April, and hopefully Hadi will join us in May again, and we'll go from there. But one of the topics that Ahmed suggested was to think about this idea of a potential common currency, and to think about it from the de-dollarization perspective. So very often those arrangements to adopt new payment systems that bypass the United States and the Western countries, to adopt the potentially common currency, sort of they're kind of grouping all of this together under the same label, right? And so one of the articles that Ahmed had shared was a recent rumor that the group of the BRICS nations, which of course include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are considering a common currency. And so what the article said, and the link to the article should be at the bottom of the screen, by the way, is that essentially what the countries are trying to do is create, or consider a process for creating a new way to make international payments that are not using either the dollar or the euro, and potentially using either common currency or doing something else that bypasses those dollar and euro mechanisms. And I think what was pretty clear throughout this article, this is one of the quotes from the, sort of, I think it was one of the, sort of Russian bureaucrats who said, well, we are looking for the recalibration of the world order, right? And you can get right away here that the sense is very much a political sense, right? It's very much a political idea. And so, my suspicion, however, is that what this, sort of what the idea being discussed is trying to do is essentially avoid the Western system for transferring funds, right? Like SWIFT, and SWIFT, I think that stands for, and correct me, those of you who know this better than I do, I think that this is the Society for Worldwide International Financial Telecommunications, right? But essentially, SWIFT is a system that automates the money transfer and the use of the correspondent banking network. And SWIFT also, by the way, has something very specific built into it. It's essentially a compliance network to accomplish a number of things, and one of them is to prevent financial crime occurring in the system being used for, for funds that are proceeds of financial crimes or other crimes, right? Essentially, sort of, and essentially, we're trying, the country is trying to get to the point where there is greater opacity rather than clarity of payments, as opposed to SWIFT. And finally, we know that Russia is under Western sanctions, for example. And so it certainly is very much afraid of having its funds and funds denominated in dollars or euros seized due to Western sanctions. And something, and this idea is probably important to China as well, because, of course, there is a great concern about potential disruption, if there is an armed conflict between China and Taiwan. And if that's the case, then, sort of money that belongs to China that travels through those networks would be subject potentially to seizure as well, right? So that's a concern to those countries. And then the idea is, well, hey, we're going to build our own amusement park, right? Sort of, we're not going to, use the Western amusement parks. We're going to build our own and use that for making our payments, and that will help us to de-dollarize or de-euroize, I guess that's probably not a word, de-euroize our payments. And that's to me, sort of that's my suspicion where this proposal is coming from. And at the very same time, at the very same time, if you look at some of the other proposals that had been floated recently, in January of this year, the presidents of Brazil and Argentina announced that they are preparing for a potential common currency as well. And for most of us, and sort of essentially that could be as much as a full currency union, right? Sort of at the coordinated central banking, so on and so forth. And a lot of us in the profession, sort of when sort of have heard that announcement, the reaction, I think, was overly quite negative. We consider, sort of most economists do consider this idea to be sort of half-baked, I think, at best, right? Bizarre is one of the expressions that I heard. But, to some extent, I think, you can probably, if you look at that article from India Times that we've just talked about, that, common currency for BRICS countries, that sounds like potentially a bit of a challenging idea as well, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to do today was kind of to talk about the overall economic framework for, optimal currency areas, for monetary unions, and we've had some really good literature in the field there, starting back in 1960s. Robert Mundell was the economist who published a very, very influential article that I've shared with you on the optimal currency area determination. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this today. But just before I move in here, one of the things that I wanted to show, if you look at the data on foreign exchange markets, and sort of this comes from the Bank for International Settlements, right? Sort of this data is very authoritative. And it shows the differences just between 2 years, 2022 and 2019. You can kind of see that United States dollar in 2022 actually has gained some traction. I mean, and this is an increase of 0.2% as compared to 2019 data. But United States dollar is involved in roughly 90% of all foreign currency exchange transactions. And you might say, oh gosh, sort of this looks like this is a little bit inflated because we are showing 88.5% for the dollar, 30.5% for the euro, 16.7% for the Japanese yen. But think about it from the perspective that they're considering currency pairs. In every trade, there are two currencies involved. And as long as the United States dollar is one of them, it will get counted in that statistic. So the total actually rises to something like 200%, right? If you consider that idea of currency pairs. But in any case, so this is the data right now. If you think about countries that have gained probably quite a bit, sort of China, CNY is the Chinese yuan. And so the share of yuan in international transactions as of April 2022 had increased quite a bit. It went from 4.3% to 7.0%, which is a large increase. But again, compared to the overall volume for the dollar, and remember, the scales here are a little different, right? Sort of this is the scale. Let me see if I can draw on this. I think I should be able to. So the scale here is out of 100%. The scale here is the, sort of it goes to a little bit more than 15%. So dollar trade volume or dollar foreign exchange trade volume is by far higher than anything else in here. And even euro, that was potentially shaped to provide an alternative to the dollar, it actually lost some traction from 2019 to 2022, right? And what do you think might be the explanation for this? Feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to put something in the chat, however you'd like to do that. Any thoughts in here?
So I think while yes, I mean all the points that you made, they are emerging ideas. So I think for the entire landscape to even start moving in the direction of GBP or yuan, I think it'll take time. I mean, people do not like to take risk with their money, so I think they still want to hold investments in USD. I mean, that would be my understanding.
That's absolutely it, right? Sort of this is a very, very good point. So, dollar provides stability. There is a reason why the US dollar is viewed as the world's reserve currency. And even though the Central Bank of the United States, which is the Federal Reserve System, often says, oh, we don't mean to be the world's reserve currency, we don't mean to be the central bank to the rest of the world, we're just a central bank to the United States, that is still very much the case, right? United States is a fairly stable country. It is a very stable democracy. It is one of the highest rated countries in the world in terms of its protection of property rights. And it does score very high, for example, in intellectual property protection, but in terms of property rights in general, it does extremely, extremely well. So folks who use dollar, they know that the dollar is here to stay. The dollar is going to be relatively stable. Their dollar holdings are not going to be expropriated for no reason, like it often happens in some of the world's developing countries. And it's really hard to displace dollar from that position, sort of given the long and storied history of the United States dollar. Ahmed, go ahead. You have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Flat. I have a question. I don't know, do we know the breakdown of this 88%? So at least we can analyze in case of any countries decide to deal with any other currency, we can know the impact of that.
Yeah. If you look here on the stuff on the right side, so it kind of shows the currency pair trades. So dollar against euro, dollar against Japan, and remember, this is just the trade, of one foreign currency being exchanged for another. Whether this is sort of a spot transaction, whether this is a future transaction or something like that, that aggregates all of this stuff. But generally speaking, kind of like dollar and euro trade, tends to be pretty high, right? Even though it had shrunk a little bit, partially, as a result of trade wars and things like that, and partially as the result, I think, of some of the growth in Chinese yuan, right? Sort of that kind of gives you a sense of what currencies are being traded for each other, and you can kind of see that dollar is extremely, extremely popular. And if I just quickly scan those numbers through and look at the currency trades that don't involve the dollar, you can kind of see that it's kind of like the exchange of euro for the British pound. That is kind of like the highest one that accounts for roughly 2% in 2022. The next highest one is euro against Japanese yen, euro against the Swiss franc. So that's kind of that breakdown, right? Does this help?
Yeah, thank you. So if we would like to analyze, for example, China or Brazil, which chart we can?
Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of the most common numbers, and so you kind of know that sort of anything else that's not included in here, it's probably going to have numbers sort of for the overall volume that is going to be less than 1%, and so for the mutual volume, it's probably going to be less than roughly 0.9%, right? Sort of these are, if we don't see something here on this chart, we know that the volume is extremely low as a percentage of total.
Got it. Okay.
But you can also go to the Bank for International Settlements, because this is just a chart from one of the Bank for International Settlement reports. You can, they make their data fairly freely available. You can kind of drill to those transactions and you can look at them sort of in much greater detail, right? I just had to get something that was a relatively good summary that tells us what the foreign exchange rate looks like. Okay. Any other questions or comments, folks? Aparna, go ahead.
Yeah, Professor, thank you. This is interesting chart. So would we have expected USD, right, the left side chart, to be even more at some point if dollar is the dominating currency?
Well, dollar, I think from that perspective, I don't know if it would necessarily expect that, because for an individual currency, because it's just one side of that bilateral transaction, the maximum is 100%, right? You won't be able to, make it above 100%, because that would presume, sort of you are trading dollar for the dollar, right? Or something like that. So no, to me, sort of, I think what is surprising in here, to me, is that the volume of dollar-denominated transaction, or the percentage of dollar-denominated transactions, actually increased over the 3 years. because and it's a relatively small increase. It's 0.2% compared to 2019, which is shown in blue. But to me, the surprise is that I would have expected euro to get a little bit stronger, and I would have expected the growth in sort of CNY to contribute and Chinese yuan to contribute more to that. But because Chinese yuan is probably most commonly traded for the dollar, it actually strengthens the dollar percentage as well.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So because of the trade relationships we have and the amount of trade exchange that happens, inherently it's keeping the dollar position still high, right?
It does. And countries, sort of that trade with each other, very commonly, sort of, and think about it from the perspective here, you might have two countries. I don't want to call them weaker currencies, but perhaps less predictable currencies. When those countries engage in, creating, or when companies from those countries engage in creating trade contracts, they very often have a pretty big incentive to essentially denominate their contracts in dollars, right? And so, and then after, sort of that transaction takes place, if they need to convert it back to their home currency or from their home currency to, sort of to the dollar, that is still going to take place. But given the stability of the dollar, it creates this preference for dollar as a transaction, as a, sort of as a measure of a lot of those trade transactions.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great, excellent. Okay,
Professor, just one additional question. How does this chart look during a recession cycle? Is it any different? Because 2019 to 2022, I guess not very different.
That's a great question. So my suspicion is, sort of if, and I think, sort of this is partially validated by this graph, when the world experiences prolonged declines in economic activity, and you can kind of think about, sort of thinking about or essentially anything that raises uncertainty like the COVID crisis has, that actually creates a bias for more use of dollar in the foreign transaction, just given that perspective of the dollar stability. And so to me, sort of this potential slight uptick in the volume of the dollar trades, or in the relative volume of the dollar trades, part of the explanation could very well be is that we've experienced the COVID crisis that raised the uncertainty of transactions everywhere, and that led to further bias toward the US dollar. And if we didn't have a COVID crisis during those 3 years, perhaps dollar might have lost some of its position in terms of those bilateral trades. But again, that's also kind of like far from certain. But fantastic point here.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right. And let me move to the new slide. Now I have to kind of get away from using this. Okay. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what we call the optimal currency area before we start engaging in our discussion in evaluating both of those proposals. So as I mentioned, we do have a pretty rich volume of optimal currency area literature that emerges sometime in 1961 with the publication of Robert Mandel's very influential article that provided a great framework for thinking of what the optimal currency area might be. And essentially, if you think about what the monetary, or currency union, tries to do, it's trying to improve the economic welfare of the country. And it does so through a couple of mechanisms. One of them is really the improved trade flows, because we know that national borders matter in trade quite a bit. And they improve trade flows by essentially reducing uncertainty of the transactions and by therefore reducing the transactional costs, right? So if you have countries that use the same currency, or if the exchange rate between those two currencies are fixed, it does reduce your expenses as a business, right? Because, for example, you no longer have to engage in hedging your trades to make sure that the swings in the currency don't impact you negatively, right? And generally speaking, sort of it kind of reduces this border effect between the countries, right? So another thing that it does, if you think about a couple of countries, and let's actually begin with a small country. Let's say that you have a small country which had inconsistent monetary policies, and probably inconsistent fiscal policies as well. And it has experienced a period of fairly high inflation. One of the easiest ways to deal with that high inflation, provided that you have appropriate credibility to do so, is to essentially tie your currency to a currency of a more stable country. For example, for a period of time, Argentina essentially tied its currency to the US dollar, and sort of that gave more assurance to its trade partners for the stability of those transactions, right? And so these are the two main benefits in a sense, but there is also a pretty significant cost to that as well. And that cost is that of a loss of a monetary policy independence. If you tie your currency to a currency of another country, or if you enter a monetary union with another country, then generally speaking, you're going to lose at least some of your independence to conduct your monetary policy. And you also, to some extent, will lose some independence on your fiscal policy as well for a number of other reasons, okay? So that's generally a significant cost and a significant consideration in thinking about that optimal currency area or that currency union. And if you look through the economic literature and you try to summarize what the typical requirements for effective currency unions are, generally speaking, they're looking at smaller countries with relative proximity to each other, right? Regional trade essentially matters a lot here. And Mandel, in his 1961 paper, said that the optimal currency may be regional rather than national, right? So Mandel actually has a really good example in his paper, if I recall correctly, that takes United States and Canada as an example, makes a couple of assumptions about the east versus the west side of the country, and the and what those two sides of those countries produce, and it gives a really nice theoretical proof that an optimal currency is going to be regional in nature. Generally speaking, you're also looking for a fairly high degree of trade openness, and one of those measures, for example, and you're probably very familiar with this measure, especially if you took my my capstone course in for core 2 while you were a student. So if you look at trade as percentage of GDP, generally speaking, that high degree of trade openness is something that contributes to that typical requirement for effective union. You're also looking for countries that are positioned in terms of their macroeconomic standing in a way that's fairly similar to each other. For example, we are saying here that the shocks must be symmetrical. So if one country experiences a negative or a positive demand shock, it's ideal if the same underlying shocks are present in the other country as well, right? And so I'll talk a little bit more about this. So the country should be in a similar state, in a similar position in their economic cycle. So if one of the countries goes through a recession, then ideally the other country should be going through recession too. And if they're, if they're on the upswing of the economic cycle, it's ideal when both countries behave in a certain way. And the reason for that is essentially monetary policy, right? Because think about situations when one country does really well economically and its GDP is growing, the other country is doing relatively poorly economically and its GDP is starting to decline. Creating a common policy here is going to be very different. And in the example I gave, so the central bank would say, oh, well, we're just going to stay on the sideline because we don't want to either make the monetary policy more expansive or more contractionary, because doing so will hurt one of the two countries. You are essentially between a rock and a hard place. Another assumption of this model is that there has to be a good degree of the labor mobility. So for example, if one country is doing relatively poorly and there is a surplus of labor, that is, there is unemployment, ideally what works really well is that if this labor is able to relocate to a different country that's a member of that currency union. And so that's the reason why in the Eurozone, one of the commitments that they made was to the mobility of labor, despite a lot of concerns. For example, the United Kingdom, had a lot of concerns about European Union by being concerned about cheap labor coming from poorer countries to the United Kingdom, and the same concerns were present, with France and with Germany and so on and so forth, right? But sort of labor mobility is typical requirement for an effective union. Of course, you have to have a strong financial system that's well developed and that's well regulated. You also have to be politically willing to be consistent in your applications of policies. So that when your government changes from one party, from the Conservative Party, for example, to a Liberal Party, you don't have big swings in terms of your fiscal policies. And so there has to be some sort of a willingness to accept some loss of your sovereignty in conducting monetary policy and some types of fiscal policies. Okay. And then finally, and sort of this is a smaller point, so I'm not planning to talk about that too much, but you're looking for fiscal system being fairly countercyclical, that is responding well to the economic shocks and increasing spending when the economy goes down. And the same has to be roughly true for immigrant remittances, and it typically is true. For example, when a country experiences a downturn, economically speaking, immigrants should be sending more remittances back to that country, and that typically tends to be the case. And so what happens if those conditions are not met? Well, the currency union simply may not be optimal. And it's very, very rare to see a currency union that meets all of those conditions perfectly. And the euro area is a great example for that, right? You have countries in different stages of economic development. For example, if you compare Germany and the United Kingdom and France to the countries on the southern periphery of Europe, countries like Spain, Greece, and Portugal, the level of economic development is quite different, right? And what is also true is there is not a perfect degree of labor mobility. And part of it is due to the differences in languages, right? Sort of it's much easier to, sort of if the East Coast is experiencing a recession of sorts in the United States, it's much easier for somebody who lost their job to pick up and move to the middle of the country, to Illinois, to move to the West Coast. It's much more of a possibility, partially because of a common language. In Europe, different languages and cultural references simply prevent that adjustment and labor mobility. And so, but still, sort of you're typically never going to be able to find that perfect match. But, we also have to be willing to accept the costs that come with it. And so we know that most likely countries in the southern European periphery probably suffered a lot more than they had to as a result of their membership in the European Monetary Union, compared to being able to run their independent policies and being able to depreciate their currencies and to become more economically competitive because of those depreciation. Greece, for example, used to do that all the time when it used the drachma, right? Therefore, the responses to recessions in Greece was typically a stronger response compared to the response that it experienced when it joined the European Monetary Union. Okay, so any questions so far, by the way? Jimmy, go ahead.
Yeah. So, glad. I mean, I wasn't aware of this. So thanks for sharing the fact that any country could tie their currency to, basically a stronger currency, if you will. But then, if that is, I mean, two questions. One, if that is possible, I'm sure there is a criteria to kind of follow that. And what are the advantages for the country who's doing it? Because if it was so easy, why wouldn't China tie their currency to, let's say, the USD or the Great British Pound? And second, what is the impact of that on its economy? Like, what are you trying to do with both?
Yeah. So one thing to keep in here is that generally we agree in economics that having a flexible exchange system is actually better for the great majority of the countries. Normally, the advantage of tying your currency to a stronger currency that is, currency used by another country, is used in very limited cases. And those cases typically have to deal with, these are smaller countries. These are smaller countries with fairly high inflation that are desperately looking to regain their credibility, and they do so by essentially tying their currency and making a credible commitment to, exchange those tied currency to the currency of the state that they tied them to in unlimited conditions. But it's difficult. And so generally those arrangements, with very few exceptions, don't last for very long. They're kind of used as a transitional mechanism to get out of a lot of trouble that you've put yourself in. And eventually the goal is to begin floating the currency again. There are a few exceptions. For example, oil-rich countries very often tie their currencies to either the dollar or the euro, or a combination of the euro and the dollar. For example, if you look at United Arab Emirates, if you looked at Saudi Arabia, and actually don't quote me on United Arab Emirates, I'm having a little bit of a brain freeze right now, but I think those two are tied to the US dollar. The, the Saudi currency, Saudi Riyal, is definitely tied to the dollar. But they also, what they have here is considerable amount of oil that they sell, and they sell their oil for dollars and for euros, right? And that gives them typically potentially fairly high reserves that their central bank can hold, so that they can maintain that exchange pad for a very long time, right? Even though in many cases it's tough. For example, when the oil prices had fallen a few years ago, Saudi Arabia suffered quite a bit, right? And so there were, some of the real concerns that this policy was not an optimal policy for them. So generally speaking, it's tying your currency to that of another country has to be used very judiciously and likely for a limited period of time, rather than to do so extensively, especially if your economies are different, right? Because when you tie your money to the United States dollar, whatever monetary policy the Fed pursues, you're basically doing the same, right? You are tied to that.
Okay, but does it like sort of insulate the exchange rate? So, for instance, $1 equals to 100 Indian rupees. I mean, does that value get frozen when you tie currencies? Or is it different?
Right. That's basically a frozen tie. You have to make a credible commitment as a central bank to stick to that exchange rate and to support that. For example, you're no longer relying on the markets to determine what the exchange rate should be, but essentially you can print, of course, your own local currency, typically in fairly unlimited quantities, but you also have to be holding a very significant reserve of the dollar in order to be able to maintain that bag during certain periods of times. And very often, if the demand for foreign currency is very, very high and the central bank runs out of its dollar reserves, that creates a huge problem, right? Things will fall apart very quickly. You're forced to stop exchanging the money. You're essentially forced to engage in capital controls, which limit how much money you can take out of the country. And that can hurt your credibility quite a bit too, and create significant recessions or depressions.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Ahmed, go ahead.
My question actually related to the same point about the Gulf countries tie with USD. So the point, in case if they decide to add another currencies to sell the oil, that means that this tie will not be longer exist, or
well, it would have to be a decision of the country and the country's central bank, or in this case, what the central bank would work as. It's essentially like an very fixed input output machine, right? There is no independence in policy. they do what they committed to, and they follow the policies of another countries. But yes, that can present all kinds of troubles. And it also ties you to the economic cycle of the United States. So for many countries, what they decide to tie their currencies to is not necessarily just to one country, but potentially to a basket of other countries. For example, you could decide, as an example, that you will tie the exchange rate to the basket of three currency: US dollar, euro, and say British pound, and each of the three will account for 33% of that bag or something like that, right? And so then your currency gains some flexibility that is related to the underlying movements between those three countries or among those three countries, and doesn't and ties you kind of jointly to the monetary policies of those three countries. So, and there's pluses and minuses to that, but that's what some of the countries do in tying their currency to a basket of currency rather than a single currency.
Yeah, the point mainly for Saudi Arabia, it's mainly tied to USD. So in case,
I think what is it, 3.75?
Yeah, 3.75, 3.75.
Yeah.
So in case of they go to trade the oil with other currency, that will impact the USD at the end, or?
I'm not sure I understood your question. So can you repeat the last couple?
So right now there is a direct tie between USD and the Saudi Arabian currency. So in case of the go to trade the oil with other currency like yuan or any other currency.
I mean, it doesn't prevent you from doing that, right? Because sort of essentially what we see is sort of that's not that much of a deal, right? So typically, what you see is that the oil contracts are denominated in dollars. That's one of the more common currencies, but there is plenty of contracts out there that are denominated in euro and in British pound, and countries with smaller countries and different currencies, they will typically rely on the dollar denominated contracts. But the idea here is that think about what might happen to in Saudi Arabia if the oil prices fell, because sort of the big base that they have for maintaining this specific exchange rate is essentially coming from the fact that there is significant amount of revenues that are coming in dollars, right? So you will always have this very big supply of dollars, and of course the real you can print yourself, right? That's your own currency, your central bank can print it. But should the oil prices fall significantly, that means that eventually you're going to run out of that pool of dollars that your central bank holds or your monetary authority holds, and you are going to be forced to either borrow more of the dollars from other central banks and other countries, or you will be forced to introduce capital controls, which limit how much money you can take in and out of the country, or you will be forced to change your exchange rate or to eliminate this bag altogether.
Okay, good.
And so that's tough. And that's actually one of the reasons why for smaller countries that don't have the benefit of being having a source of oil right under their sands, typically fixed exchange rate regimes, they don't last very long. They're used kind of, I don't want to say that they're used almost as a transitional mechanism, but it could be a relatively long transitional mechanism, but eventually everybody moves on to a floating system.
Yeah, the point also, they follow the same monetary policy of US for interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
But in any case, so if you sort of given those conditions, and this I think is probably a question for all of us, let's talk out the viability of those proposals. Do you think it makes sense for the BRICS countries to create a common currency? And if so, why or why not? And does it make sense for Brazil and Argentina to do the same? What do you think? Nick?
Hi, Vlad. Hi, guys. Actually, what you said is very true. Primarily, the countries that have their currencies pegged to the US dollar are basically countries where the USD is the main source of income. So that's so basically they earn the delta X on imports versus output, so it's important to maintain the stability. Now, having said that, if the main source of income shifts from USD to some other currency, let's say the yuan, as is probably happening in Saudi Arabia now, that would actually be the most valid reason why Saudi would have to shift. And if you now see the trends that I see in the Middle East and India, Russia, China are getting together. So the Chinese imports are primarily now from the Middle East and from Russia. And probably, although the trade in USD by volume or amounts, maybe 98 or 80%, whatever of the world trade, maybe these intercurrency bilateral agreements are not reported to BIS. Could that be an option? Because for BRICS, especially, I see now firsthand, like the trade with Russia and India especially has gone down. I mean, the cost of trade has gone down by as much as 3 to 7%. That is because we don't deal in dollars anymore. Nowadays, it's a straight exchange between something called the nostro and the vostro accounts. I'm not too sure about what they actually mean.
So, I mean, these are facilities that the central banks have created to essentially, maintain the movements of money, right? But okay.
So my point is, if that be true, then BRICS currency, although it might not be a union per se, like a union would be rather extreme way of having a common currency. Maybe this method of nostro, vostro, and this currency basket thing, this could be a good intermediate way of cutting down costs, which most of these countries are doing as we speak. At the same time, get rid of dollars so that nobody kind of throttles their economies should things go downhill.
I mean, good points, both of those. But think about it from this perspective. So, right now, okay, so India and China, or Russia and India, for example. So Russian producers, sort of despite the fact that some of them are private, they're basically following the state policy. The state tells them what to do. And so from that perspective, you have a trade where, sort of the state on one side controls nearly all of the volume. And, sort of on the side, of India, the state probably controls a pretty fair percentage of that volume as well. So from that perspective, logistically speaking, that becomes a little bit easier. Think about it for a while. If you consider private parties engaging in those proposals, so not something that is dictated by the state, but it's the private parties. So the Indian rupee inflation is fairly decent, right? Sort of fairly high, right? And there is also a good amount of exchange rate variation. And the same goes for the Russian ruble. And for the Russian ruble, a big challenge is that the conflict in Ukraine introduces a lot of uncertainty to those movements. So if you had private parties engaging in those transactions, then would private parties prefer to conduct their business in dollars, or would they prefer to conduct their business to the direct exchange into the national currencies? You might say, well, if you're talking about immediate payments, right, sort of contracts that are short-term contracts, using the national currencies might be okay. When you move to the long-term transactions, contracts that should be executed over the term of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or something like that. And, sort of very often there is, long-term contracts involved in those. Wouldn't you rather use the dollar?
That what you're saying is true, Vlad. But in this case, like both these currencies and the exchange rates, I mean, the trade and the contracts are actually underwritten by both the Indian state and the Russian state. So
exactly.
They are, so in that case, the private, like let's say today, as an Indian, if I were to sign a long-term contract with the Russian entity, although it might be a private company, both of these contracts are still underwritten by the Indian and the Russian government. So as far as the private guy is concerned, the costs go down, and they don't have this risk of their US currencies getting frozen because of some entities list and all that. So since it's a sovereign guarantee, like as an Indian company, I am guaranteed by the Indian government. I have nothing to do with the Russian government.
Yep, exactly.
So it works perfectly fine for us. I mean, from my point of view.
Yeah, and sort of that's the reason why those contracts take place, right? And I mean, essentially by bypassing the dollar system and by essentially involving the government in those guarantees, that's how the transaction costs are reduced for the individual companies, even though there is still someone else, which is likely the population of Russia, for example, that carries the overall cost of the instability of those contracts and essentially selling the oil for less than what the world prices are, right? So from that perspective, so what you see is really dependence. You see other goals being accomplished, right? Sort of the main goal is preventing the Western payment networks. And given the relatively high level of corruption in both countries, by doing so, you're also reducing the financial crime reporting, and you're creating more opacity in those transactions so that corruption may flourish as well. So eventually, I think what that does is that it hurts the people of both of those countries in the long run by essentially preventing honest market dealing and creating a better system for corruption and graft to flourish.
But how would that happen? Because actually the prices would be determined by the market demand and supply situation. So that is
But these
what
are
is
not
happening
necessarily
here
the
as well.
market demand and supply, right? Sort of there's a intergovernment agreements where that bypass the markets altogether.
I'm not too sure because we are free to tie up with any private entity. So the government does not tell us to whom to tie up with and at what rates. It's just like once the deal is done between the private companies, it's after that the governments come into the play.
And no, so, I agree with all of that. But I think the idea here is that for India, it's probably a much better deal than for Russia. As comparing, for example, sort of if Russia had the ability to sell that in the open markets, right? And sort of for India, those sort of contracts and those sort of payment mechanisms and arrangements that may hurt the country in the long run, because whenever non-market mechanisms are involved, there is typically a high potential for corruption and graft to take place in those opaque systems that prevent reporting of financial crimes, that prevent proper allocation of resources, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's kind of like the point that I'm making. But in generally speaking, sort of if you think about the BRICS countries, sort of it sounds like, sort of Nikhil, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it sounds like creating systems for bilateral payments that bypass the dollar might kind of make sense for the countries given the geopolitical realities that we have right now, right? Because Russia wants to prevent the revenues from being seized by the Western payment networks, and India benefits from actually having cheaper access to oil, cheaper oil prices. But does that mean that potentially a common currency for the BRICS country, for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, would that make sense? What do folks think? Feel free to speak up.
That's what it is. And let me tell new people, right? We have been doing it. Malad has been very open to do that, but this is a platform for not back and forth debating for a very long time because others are there. So again, I don't mean to offend anyone, but I'm just telling you that maybe after 2 questions, we should stop and let others talk about it as well. So that's the reason we joined this. My point is, Vlad and Nick here is, I take it much more simpler because macroeconomics to me, it's not day-to-day function, right? It's all about, 10, 20, 30 years of time frame. And the other thing is that what I'm also reading more and more, and I'm realizing that macro is much more simpler than typically we make it to be, right? These are very much the fundamental concepts, and if they're aligned. So for me, when I see this, right, it's not a question whether these BRICS countries and other countries should not come up with currency. The question in my mind is whether they'll be successful and whether they'll be successful in the long term. And right now, based on the information that I have or what I see from the very fundamental macro perspective, I don't see any reason. I don't see that they'll be successful, right? Things may change over time. And to me, it's very much connected with the very fundamental reasons regarding, political consistency, as you said, land of law, people having this. So China may be leading the whole, let's say, the bandwagon, right? But the question becomes like, does the world take China as a very stable country, right? And when we talk about stability, what do we think stability is, right? Is it political stability, or is it autocracy that will be more stable? So I'm going to stop here, but my point, which I wanted to make quickly, was it's about long term. That's one. And second is basically it's much more these fundamental concepts that I try to see these the news and so on, and like, yeah, it may take a little bit more time. And so I'm going to stop here, but I just want to jump in and say, and again, didn't mean to offend anyone. My point was that others want to ask questions as well. But if we get into back and forth for a very long time, it doesn't allow others to.
Thank you, Farhan. And this is my fault, of course. So I apologize for that. If they took a little bit longer with those questions, but these were good questions too. But anyway, sort of that's one of the reasons I tried to, kind of limit my talk to maybe about 30 minutes and leave some time for the Q&A. But, sort of the point that I'm trying to make, if you're going by this list of, sort of fairly non-controversial requirements for effective currency unions, right? If you basically fail all of them when we consider the BRICS model, right? The idea of a common currency for BRICS. These are not countries in relative proximity to each other. Overall, they do a lot more trade with other countries than with each other, even though Russia is becoming much more dependent on Chinese trade those days. So that's slightly different. The shocks to aggregate demand and aggregate supply are probably going to be very different between those countries, right? Because there are literally on different ends of the world, they are all over the map. There is no mobility of labor. Some of those countries, especially, sort of South Africa, for example, the financial system is not a potential politically, not a very strong one, right? And there is probably not a lot of will by those countries and by their leaders to lose their sovereignty in setting monetary policy based on the collective benefit of all of the countries. And you can easily see in those countries some of their leaders reversing those decisions fairly quickly, right? And so from that perspective, we are extremely skeptical in the profession about the idea of a currency union for BRICS, right? If you're talking about Brazil and Argentina, it's still a bit of a bizarre proposal, at least to me, right? But especially given that sort of the differences in shocks, a lot less. In Argentina, if you look at Argentinian inflation, which had been as high as 100%, I think, in the recent years, sort of compared to Brazil, where inflation is still high, but of course nowhere even close to 100%. I think sort of this might be a pretty bad deal for Brazil, actually, as compared to Argentina, right? For Argentina, it might be a better deal because you're tying your currency to a currency of a more stable country. And so hopefully you're gaining some credibility. And by doing so, but again, this commitment has to be a fairly credible commitment. And people who deal with those currencies, all of your trade partners have to believe that, sort of you have credibility in committing to this currency union for a very long time. And so for those reasons, my suspicion is that those monetary unions are likely not going to happen. Creating, sort of better payment systems that bypass the international payment systems and, are more of bilateral trading payment systems is probably much more likely. But big chunk of that too also deals with the political needs of those countries rather than the underlying economic needs. Okay. Jimmy, you had your hand up, I think, a while ago. Anything that you wanted to ask or to comment on, give your opinion?
No, I think I was leaning more towards for being I was for BRICS, but I mean, given the criteria that you've outlined, it makes sense, why it'll be unstable. I just thought one more thing from an economic standpoint. Every time we exchange in US dollar, we are sending money back to the US, even though transactions are happening between, let's say, China and India, because the exchange is in USD. So I think even to chip off or get rid of that additional transaction fee, if you will, if they create a local system, the money stays in the region. I mean, that could be one of the minor reasons, but I don't think
money doesn't. I mean, I think it's not necessarily correct to say that the money gets sent to the United States, right? Simply think about that as using the US dollar as a more dependent store of value for those transactions and making the transactions more predictable. If what you're using is that if, sort of the argument in here, we are going to bypass the US dollar altogether, and eventually if a lot of countries do that, that will take away from the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Okay, well, so, sort of that part I think is true, right? And it will take away some power from the United States, some of the soft economic power that United States exercises. But at the very same time, bypassing the dollar also creates the risks for the other countries, right? Think about using the dollar in a sense as buying an insurance policy that says your payments are going to be relatively stable. And if what you're engaging in is a contract that's denominated in the US dollar, sort of if, relatively low inflation the last few years accepted, right? And relatively good stability, you're actually taking away from the predictability of those contracts, right? And that can carry a real cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Thanks, Vlad.
Okay, all right, very good. Folks, any other comments or questions? Or, by the way, ideas for future sessions are very much welcome. I mean, I'm really glad that we were discussing this idea of de-dollarization and currency unions. It seemed like quite a few people had, sort of, thought of this as a good topic, and we had a good discussion. But anything else that you think we should include in future discussions? And feel free to, sort of run those ideas now. Feel free to, post on the, sort of in the group page on LinkedIn. Anything else before we call it a day? Because it is getting close to, it is about 2 o'clock, and I'm going to be respectful of your time.
This was a great session. Thanks, Professor. When I saw the news, did not know what to think of it, but this thing just lays it out really well.
Okay, great.
I'm also taking the global strategy class, and there's like a lot of financial history in that course. So I'm also wondering if like regional macroeconomics across the different continents might be a topic. I have a very global role, and so this really helps, provide perspective.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want to flesh it out a little bit more, because regional macroeconomics, it's kind of, I mean, we'd have to be a little more specific in fleshing out, sort of this idea. But absolutely, yes, we are very happy to talk more about this, especially is that very often just by the nature of where the program is and where we are, we take a little bit of the US-centric view in selecting the topics and the way how we approach those topics. But absolutely, feel free to reach out, sort of send me an email, send me a message. We can flesh this out a little bit more.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Any other comments, folks?
I mean, the only thing I'll add, Professor, is I keep saying that we are still in the same business cycle, right? The past year, so a lot of things that you and Professor Hadi could go back, take a look at the previous sessions and see that what you may want to pull, right? Dollar index was another one discussed, where dollar is, because that will change a lot of things, right? So my point is, we could also tell you a lot of, but I think you could also pull a lot of topics from the, last, I don't know, 8 sessions and say, I want to talk about this because I want to see where these things are now, right?
Okay, yeah, we can do like a bit of a flashback saying, sort of how have things changed. That sounds good. All right, excellent. All right, well,
the housing market, the prediction of the housing market. I mean, maybe look 6 months from now and see where that is, because I mean, everybody has been anticipating a crash for the extremists. I don't think it's going to happen, but I mean, we've already seen a softened real estate market. So where that's headed in the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And especially, given the fact that when people say crash, is that sort of some of the less optimistic predictions show a contraction of say 8%. But given that in the last few years, prices increased by over 25% in many areas of the country, sort of that correction of 8% doesn't look like a particularly large correction. But sure, that sounds like an interesting topic to come back to. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, folks, thanks very much for joining me. Much appreciated. Hope to see you soon. If there are any of you who are going to be in Urbana-Champaign for the graduation in May, I look forward to seeing you there. And talk to you soon. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
bye for now.